Okay, well, we're in starting in Job chapter 28 this evening, and we've come here to a new section in the book. We've seen the long section from chapter 3 after the introduction with the prologue and the scene being set in the first two chapters. We then had this long series of chapters of these three rounds of speeches between Job and his three friends, which concluded with Job's final speech in chapter 27. We come then to the second part of the book, really, and we'll begin in chapter 28 with an interlude on the subject of wisdom, and then we go into the speeches of some more speeches, this time of Job and Elihu, a character who we've not met up to now. And this takes us from chapter 28 through to chapter 37, where we have this section. So this evening we'll be looking at chapters 28 to 31, beginning with this interlude on wisdom in chapter 28. Chapter 28 is really a standalone chapter. It's not really connected to what went before or what comes after in terms of its content and the tone of the message that we have in chapter 28. And so for this reason, some commentators have questioned whether chapter 28 is a continuation of the words of Job from chapter 27. So are these the words of Job himself? Others suggest that this is the conclusion of Elihu's speech, and we've not met Elihu yet, which has become misplaced in the text. Others suggest that they are the words of one of Job's three friends, or perhaps they are the words of the narrator, the author of the book, the one who has put this book together. Whoever the author or the speaker may be, the words of chapter 28 do provide a sort of interlude, a pause between the debate that's taken place between Job and his three friends, and then the speeches that are about to come from Job, Elihu, and God himself. And the chapter concerns the question of wisdom. Where can wisdom be found? And that question is asked twice in the chapter in verse 12, but where can wisdom be found? Where is the source of understanding? And in verse 20, but whence does wisdom come? Where is the source of understanding? One commentator has described this chapter as a marvelous hymn to wisdom. And uh, Job needs wisdom. Job needs this wisdom if he is to be able to understand and accept his circumstances. So an outline of the chapter would be something like this. So first of all, in verses 1 to 12, we learn that wisdom cannot be discovered in the earth. And then wisdom cannot be purchased in verses 13 to 19. And then the final section, verse 28 to 20 to 28, that God alone is the source of wisdom. So we begin here in chapter 28, reading verses 1 to 12. There is a mine for silver and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken out of the earth and copper smelted from rock. He sets bounds for darkness. To every limit man probes, to rocks in deepest darkness. They open up a shaft far from where men live, in places forgotten by wayfarers, destitute of men, far removed. Earth out of which food grows is changed below as if into fire. Its rocks are a source of sapphires. It contains gold dust too. No bird of prey knows the path to it. The falcon's eye has not gazed upon it. The proud beasts have not reached it. The lion has not crossed it. Man sets his hand against the flinty rock and overturns mountains by the roots. He carves out channels through rock. His eyes behold every precious thing. He dams up the sources of the stream so that hidden things may be brought to light. But where can wisdom be found? Where is the source of understanding? The writer is describing here the activity of man in digging into the earth, of mining below the earth's surface in order to discover metal ores and precious stones. He says iron is taken out of the earth and copper smelted from rock. Its rocks are a source of sapphires. It contains gold dust too. And he mentions animals and birds, such as the falcon renowned for its keen eyesight, and the lion renowned for its courage, both of which cannot gain access to the wealth that is to be found underground. And although man may be able to find precious things in the earth, he says in verse 10, his eyes behold every precious thing, he cannot find wisdom there. But where can wisdom be found? Where is the source of understanding? He then goes on in verses 13 to 19 to tell us that wisdom cannot be purchased either. No man can set a value on it. It cannot be found in the land of the living. The deep says, it is not in me. The sea says, I do not have it. It cannot be bartered for gold. Silver cannot be paid out as its price. The finest gold of Ophir cannot be weighed against it, nor precious onyx, nor sapphire. Gold or glass cannot match its value, nor vessels of fine gold be exchanged for it. Coral and crystal cannot be mentioned with it. A pouch of wisdom is better than rubies. Topaz from Nubia cannot match its value. Pure gold cannot be weighed against it. The writer is showing us here that wisdom cannot be purchased. No man can set a value on it, he says. Wisdom cannot be obtained from the world. It's not to be found in the deep or in the sea, and it cannot be exchanged for gold or bought with silver, and even the finest gold of Ophir will not buy it. The writer lists many precious stones and precious items, none of which can be used to buy wisdom. He mentions onyx, sapphire, coral, rubies, and topaz. None of these can match the value of wisdom. In verses 20 to 28, then, he goes on to tell us the source of wisdom, the true source of wisdom. But whence does wisdom come? Where is the source of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all living, concealed from the fowl of heaven. Abaddon and death say, we have only a report of it. God understands the way to it. He knows its source, for he sees to the ends of the earth, observes all that is beneath the heavens. When he fixed the weight of the winds, set the measure of the waters, when he made a rule for the rain and a course for the thunderstorms, then he saw it and gauged it. He measured it and probed it. He said to man, see, fear of the Lord is wisdom. To shun evil is understanding. The final section of the chapter then answers this question, but whence does wisdom come? Where is the source of understanding? It's something that is hidden from the eyes of the living and from the birds of the air. Abaddon and death, the realm of the dead, the underworld, have only heard a rumor of it. But it is God alone who knows the way to wisdom and knows its source. God sees everything under the heavens, and wisdom is embedded in his power of creation. It's inherent in the world that he has created. And the writer gives some examples of God's wisdom within the creation. He speaks of the winds, the waters, and the rain, and the thunderstorms. Then the final verse of the chapter answers the question of verse 12 and verse 20. How can we have wisdom and understanding? How can we find it? Verse 28 says, see, fear of the Lord is wisdom. To shun evil is understanding. Wisdom is available to man, but it doesn't come from the earth, and it cannot be purchased. Wisdom comes from God. God knows the way to wisdom, and so it is a gift of God, and it has been revealed by him. It comes from the fear of the Lord and by shunning evil, which is what Job had been trying to do, and which he asserts he is doing in the following chapters as well. A summary then of chapter 28 from one of the commentaries. This one's by The Message of Job by David Atkinson in the Bible Speaks Today series. He says the wisdom which will contain an answer to Job can come only from God. Chapter 28 thus stands in the book of Job as a warning that any further speculations along the lines of the three friends will be fruitless. The way out of the impasse will not be from below upwards, but from above downwards. It will not come as part of the belief system of mankind, but only as a gift of God. The starting point of true knowledge of God is God himself in his own self-disclosure. We need to meet the Lord as he comes to us in grace. We need to begin with the fear of the Lord, in communion with him as he chooses to make himself known. So we move on then to chapters 29 to 37, which is the next major section in the book. And there are two speeches in this section of the book. First of all, there's a speech by Job from chapter 29 to chapter 31, in which he summarizes his current predicament and he asserts his innocence. And then the second speech in the section is made by this new character who's introduced to us for the first time now. His name is Elihu, who gives, in his speech, gives a critical review of the debate between Job and his three friends, and he offers all of them some advice or his view on the situation. So this evening we're going to look at Job's speech here in these chapters, from chapter 29 to chapter 31. And in chapter 29, Job is reflecting upon his past, how things were in the past for him. That we are about to begin a new section is indicated by the phrase in verse 1 there, Job again took up his theme and said, and that provides the introduction to what he's about to say. So we'll read here, first of all, chapter 29, verses 2 to 6. Where Job is speaking about how his life has been blessed by God. Oh, that I were in months gone by, in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone over my head, when I walked in the dark by its light, when I was in my prime, when God's company graced my tent, when Shaddai was still with me, when my lads surrounded me, when my feet were bathed in cream, and rocks poured out streams of oil for me. Here Job is thinking back to the time in his life when God had watched over him, guided him, befriended him, and blessed him. He says, when God's company, or Revised Standard Version has friendship, when God's friendship graced my tent. Then he says, when my feet were bathed in cream, and rocks poured out streams of oil for me. So he's picturing here the prosperity that he had enjoyed at that time. So these were happier times for Job. These were the good old days. He says, when I was in my prime, he says, or as I was in my autumn days. In verses 7 to 11, he goes on to talk about how he had in the past been publicly honored, publicly recognized. So verses 7 to 11, he says, when I passed through the city gates to take my seat in the square, young men saw me and hid. Elders rose and stood. Nobles held back their words. They clapped their hands to their mouths. The voices of princes were hushed. Their tongues stuck to their palates. The ear that heard me acclaimed me. The eye that saw commended me. In the past, then, Job was an upstanding and respected member of his community, one who was held in high esteem. The city gate mentioned in verse 7 was the place where business was conducted and where the city leaders would assemble to conduct their business, a bit like the town hall we might think of as that kind of thing today. He mentions that people stood up when he arrived. Even the elders stood up for Job, and the nobles and the princes remained silent. They wanted to listen. They wanted to hear what Job had to say. In verses 12 to 17, he then goes on to speak of how he had shown care for the vulnerable. He says, "For I saved the poor man who cried out, the orphan who had none to help him. I received the blessing of the lost. I gladdened the heart of the widow. I clothed myself in righteousness, and it robed me. Justice was my cloak and turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I looked into the case of the stranger. I broke the jaws of the wrongdoer, and I wrested prey from his teeth." Job had defended and he had provided for the vulnerable in society. And he lists the different groups there whom he has helped: the poor, the orphans, the widows, the lost, the blind, the lame, the stranger. He speaks of himself being clothed in righteousness and justice, in those qualities, as if they were his clothing. And he had punished the wrongdoer in verse 17. And this was really how Job had expected to live out his life, as he goes on in verses 18 to 25 to describe. "I thought I would end my days with my family and be as long-lived as the phoenix, my roots reaching water and dew lying on my branches, my vigor refreshed, my bow ever new in my hand. Men would listen to me expectantly and wait for my counsel. After I spoke, they had nothing to say. My words were as drops of dew upon them. They waited for me as for rain, for the late rain, their mouths open wide. When I smiled at them, they would not believe it. They never expected a sign of my favor. I decided their course and presided over them. I lived like a king among his troops, like one who consoles mourners." This was how Job had expected to live out his life, with this honor and prosperity, with people showing respect towards him. Job expected people to listen to him and to accept his counsel and to be comforted by his words. And his words, he says, would be like the refreshing rain, the rain that people wait for. So long life, prosperity, and respect were the things that Job expected in life. And at that time, Job says that he had lived like a king among his troops. So chapter 29 there, Job is thinking back to the past, back to the good old days, how he was regarded by people, the things that he had done for others during that time. And so he moves on in chapter 30 then to talk about his present circumstances and what has happened to him. He begins in chapter 30, verse 1, "But now." So that highlights the contrast between what had happened in the past and what is happening for him in the present. In verse 9 as well, he introduces that again, the contrast there. "Now," he says, and in verse 16, "So now." So this is how it was, but now this is how things are. So all of those past achievements and the respect and honor that had come to Job, which he's described in chapter 29, all of that is lost now in chapter 30. And in a complete reversal of circumstances, Job is treated with contempt. So we'll read chapter 30, verses 1 to 15. He says, "But now those younger than I deride me, men whose fathers I would have disdained to put among my sheepdogs. Of what use to me is the strength of their hands? All their vigor is gone. Wasted from want and starvation, they flee to a parched land, to the gloom of desolate wasteland. They pluck saltwood and wormwood. The roots of broom are their food, driven out from society. They are cried at like a thief. They live in the gullies of the waddies, in holes in the ground and in rocks, braying among the bushes, huddling among the nettles, scoundrels, nobodies, stricken from the earth. Now I am the butt of their jibes. I have become a byword to them. They abhor me. They keep their distance from me. They do not withhold spittle from my face. Because God has disarmed and humbled me, they have thrown off restraint in my presence. Mere striplings assail me at my right hand. They put me to flight. They build their roads for my ruin. They tear up my path. They promote my fall, although it does them no good. They come as through a wide breach. They roll in like raging billows. Terror tumbles upon me. It sweeps away my honor like the wind. My dignity vanishes like a cloud. Job is treated with contempt. He's looked down upon and he's made sport of by those he considers to be the lowest in society, those who are younger than him, whose fathers would not even be counted amongst Job's sheepdogs. And he describes these people who are making fun of him as themselves living like animals in the wasteland, that they are uncivilized people. In verse 8, he describes them as scoundrels, nobodies, stricken from the earth. And in verses 9 to 15, we see that it is Job who is being treated as an outcast. He is a byword to them. They abhor him. They keep aloof from him. They spit at the sight of him. And they have set out to ruin him, and no one restrains them. His honor and his dignity have been lost. In verse 15, he says, my dignity vanishes like a cloud. And Job blames God for this. In verses 16 to 23, he says, so now my life runs out. Days of misery have taken hold of me. By night my bones feel gnawed. My sinews never rest. With great effort I change clothing. The neck of my tunic fits my waist. He regarded me as clay. I have become like dust and ashes. I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I wait, but you do not consider me. You have become cruel to me. With your powerful hand you harass me. You lift me up and mount me on the wind. You make my courage melt. I know you will bring me to death, the house assigned for all the living. Days of misery have taken hold of Job, he says in verse 16. And he describes his physical suffering there in verses 17 and 18. It feels as if his bones are being gnawed, he says. And he says, I have become like dust and ashes. He describes there in verse 18, he says, the neck of my tunic fits my waist, which is perhaps a description of his wasted, emaciated appearance, that the neck of his tunic would fit around his waist. He has become like the dust and the ashes which he sits in. And Job then addresses God in verses 20 to 23, and he complains once again that God is not listening to him. I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I wait, but you do not consider me. And Job accuses God of being cruel and harassing him, of throwing him around in a storm. And what Job knows is that eventually God will bring him to death. Verse 23, he speaks of the house assigned for all the living. So death is the meeting place, assigned for all, the place where all of the living eventually end up. Well, he then goes on in verses 24 to 31 to describe once again his desolate situation. He says, surely he would not strike at a ruin if in calamity one cried out to him. Did I not weep for the unfortunate? Did I not grieve for the needy? I looked forward to good fortune, but evil came. I hoped for light, but darkness came. My bowels are in turmoil without respite. Days of misery confront me. I walk about in sunless gloom. I rise in the assembly and cry out. I have become a brother to jackals, a companion to ostriches. My skin blackened is peeling off me. My bones are charred by the heat. So my lyre is given over to mourning, my pipe to accompany weepers. Because Job had wept for the unfortunate and he had grieved for the needy, he expected good to come, but instead evil came. He expected his good works to be rewarded. He says in verse 26, I hoped for light, but darkness came. So Job has learnt that God does not always bless the righteous, and righteousness does not make a person immune to suffering. Job was in a state of inner turmoil over his present condition. He says again, days of misery confront me. Verse 16, he'd mentioned the days of misery there as well. And now again in verse 27, days of misery confront. That's all he can see ahead of him, days of misery. And then in verses 28 to 30, he describes his physical condition again, that his skin is blackened and it falls from him, and his bones burn with heat. And his social isolation means that his companions are the jackals and the ostriches. He's excluded from society. He's out amongst the wild animals. And the musical instruments that he would have used for singing songs of rejoicing have instead become instruments to be used for mourning and for weeping. In verse 31, he says, so my lyre is given over to mourning, my pipe to accompany weepers. The lyre was a sort of small instrument, a bit like a harp. Instead of using these instruments to rejoice with, he says they're being used for mourning and for weeping. Moving on to chapter 31 then, Job in this chapter goes on to deny any wrongdoing on his part. God must know what Job is doing, he says in verses 1 to 4 of chapter 31. He says, I have covenanted with my eyes not to gaze on a maiden. What fate is decreed by God above? What lot by Shaddai in the heights? Calamity is surely for the iniquitous, misfortune for the worker of mischief. Surely he observes my ways, takes account of my every step. Job expresses his belief here that it is the wicked who will suffer. In verse 3, he says, calamity is surely for the iniquitous, misfortune for the worker of mischief. Again, that's the idea expressed by his friends that suffering is for those who have done wrong. Anything bad that happens to you, you must have done something bad to deserve that. And that's what Job is expressing there in verse 3. Job says that he has made a covenant with his eyes to avoid looking at a maiden. And he believes that God knows how he has behaved, and God will take account of that. In verse 4, he says, surely he observes my ways, takes account of my every step. God knows all about me, Job is saying. God knows what I'm like. And then in verses 5 to 40, rest of the chapter here, we have Job's final words here. He says, have I walked with worthless men, or my feet hurried to deceit? Let him weigh me on the scale of righteousness. Let God ascertain my integrity. If my feet have strayed from their course, my heart followed after my eyes, and a stain sullied my hands, may I sow but another reap. May the growth of my field be uprooted. If my heart was ravished by the wife of my neighbor, and I lay in wait at his door, may my wife grind for another, may others kneel over her. For that would have been debauchery, a criminal offence, a fire burning down to Abaddon, consuming the roots of all my increase. Did I ever brush aside the case of my servants, man or maid, when they made a complaint against me? What then should I do when God arises? When he calls me to account, what should I answer him? Did not he who made me in my mother's belly make him? Did not one form us both in the womb? Did I deny the poor their needs, or let a widow pine away by eating my food alone, the fatherless not eating of it also? Why, from my youth he grew up with me as though I were his father. Since I left my mother's womb, I was her guide. I never saw an unclad wretch, a needy man without clothing, whose loins did not bless me, as he warmed himself with the shearings of my sheep. If I raised my hand against the fatherless, looking to my supporters in the gate, may my arm drop off from my shoulder, my forearm break off at the elbow. For I am in dread of God-sent calamity. I cannot bear his threat. Did I put my reliance on gold, or regard fine gold as my bulwark? Did I rejoice in my great wealth, in having attained plenty? If ever I saw the light shining, the moon on its course in full glory, and I secretly succumbed, and my hand touched my mouth in a kiss, that too would have been a criminal offence, for I would have denied God above. Did I rejoice over my enemy's misfortune? Did I thrill because evil befell him? I never let my mouth sin by wishing his death in a curse. Indeed, the men of my clan said we would consume his flesh insatiably. No sojourner spent the night in the open. I opened my doors to the road. Did I hide my transgressions like Adam, bury my wrongdoing in my bosom, that I should now fear the great multitude, and am shattered by the contempt of families, so that I keep silent and do not step outdoors? Oh, that I had someone to give me a hearing. Oh, that Shaddai would reply to my writ, or my accuser draw up a true bill. I would carry it on my shoulder, tie it around me for a wreath. I would give him an account of my steps, offer it as to a commander. If my land cries out against me, its furrows weep together. If I have eaten its produce without payment, and made its rightful owners despair, may nettles grow there instead of wheat, instead of barley, stinkweed. The words of Job are at an end. So if Job has done anything wrong, he's willing for God to weigh him, he says, on the scale of righteousness and ascertain his integrity. And Job lists a catalogue of sins here, which in this oath of innocence, he denies that he has ever committed. But if he has, he is prepared to accept the consequences. And this is Job's answer to the accusations that were made against him by Eliphaz in his earlier speech in chapter 22, verses 5 to 11. If you recall that speech, Eliphaz had made a number of outrageous accusations against Job. Job uses this pattern here in this section. He says, if I have done this, if I have committed this crime or this sin, then may this penalty, this punishment happen to me. So it's the principle of an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, the retribution principle. If I have done this, then may this happen to me. And Job's plea against all of the charges here is not guilty. He's not guilty of any of these things. And then we have this long list of these various sins or crimes that Job denies that he's ever committed. So in verses 5 to 8, he's talking about falsehood and deceit. He's never been false. He's never deceived anyone. In verses 9 to 11, he talks about lust and adultery, and he describes it as being a criminal offense. In verses 13 to 15, he talks about the mistreatment of his servants. He never mistreated his servants. And in fact, he says, we were all formed in our mother's womb, so we're all the same, we're all equal. In verses 16 to 23, he denies that he ever neglected the poor. In verses 24 and 25, he denies trusting in material wealth. He never placed his trust in his wealth. And in verses 26 to 28, he denies idolatry, the worship of the sun and the moon, and the kissing of the hand. Again, he describes that as being a criminal offense. In verses 29 to 30, he denies rejoicing over the ruin of others. He took no satisfaction when others were ruined. In verses 31 and 32, he denies that he's ever refused to show hospitality to anyone. And in verses 33 to 34, he denies hypocrisy. He says that he has never tried to hide his sins like Adam. The word Adam can be used as the name of the first man, but the word Adam itself simply means man. So it's whether he's talking about Adam as the person, the first man, or whether he's talking about mankind in general there when he says that he'd never tried to hide his sins, perhaps as Adam did, or as mankind in general tries to do. In verses 35 to 37, we see again that Job wants to have his case settled, and he's confident that he will be vindicated. So despite all of the things that have happened, Job is still looking to God for this vindication, and he trusts that God will find no fault in him. That's the purpose of him, what he's doing in this chapter of taking this oath to assert his innocence of these things. And he's confident, trusts that God will find that to be the case. So he is prepared here to stake his reputation on this. And if God does not respond, if there's still no answer from God, then surely that would clear Job. It's as if Job is giving God the opportunity to answer him back and say, yes, you did do these things. So if there is no answer, then silence it would be taken by Job as his vindication. In verses 38 to 40, he goes back to talking about, again, denying some of the things that things that he has not done, and he has not exploited the use of the land here. He says, if my land cries out against me, its furrows weep together. If I have eaten its produce without payment and made its rightful owners despair, may nettles grow there instead of wheat, instead of barley stinkweed. So the land is personified there as if it is crying out and weeping. If Job has misused the land in any way, then may it not be productive. May it bring out these weeds, nettles and stinkweed, he says. And then at the end of verse 40 there, just the final note, the words of Job are at an end. So that concludes what Job has had to say. And Job, he's going to speak again, but very briefly in response to God, as we'll see in chapter 40, verses 3 to 5, and then in chapter 42, verses 1 to 6. So some brief words of Job to come. But this is now really the end of these long speeches that we've had from Job. And there is no more for him to say. He's finally drawing his case to a conclusion here in this chapter, and with this assertion of his innocence. So over these three chapters, chapter 29, chapter 30, and chapter 31, we see Job in his final speech here, first of all, looking back to the happier days, to the good old days when he enjoyed life, and then his present circumstances in chapter 30, the things that he's suffering, how he is now regarded by others. And then in chapter 31, how he continues to maintain his integrity and his innocence, and this long list of these sins which he denies that he has ever committed. And with that, he rests his case, as we might say. So a few questions from the chapters we've looked at. We've gone through four chapters we've looked at this evening. So what does it mean to fear the Lord? We were told that in chapter 28 there, that wisdom was found in fearing the Lord. What does that actually mean, to fear the Lord? What does chapter 29 say about Job's previous position and his reputation? And do you think Job's suffering changed his view of how God deals with people? Now that Job has finished speaking, how would you assess his spiritual condition at this particular point. And then the next time we meet, which will be on the 8th of January, we'll be looking at Elihu's first speeches in chapters 32 to 34. So we'll